Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So, on to our subject this evening. My talk is entitled The Rebel and the Fox, although the rebel himself was also a fox, and the fox is himself a kind of a rebel. So they're a bit interchangeable as to who is who. And this is really a talk born of a collision of interests of mine, one being the Duke of Monmouth, who you see here on the right, Charles II's illegitimate son, a subject of study of mine for a few years, and the other being the Landmark Trust, and in particular, a specific building which is connected to him. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about this evening. So our story begins back in the momentous 12 months before this famous event, the execution of Charles I outside the banqueting house in January 1649. It was, of course, the culmination, the most dramatic event of a civil war that had lasted 7 years and which would change England and indeed Britain utterly over the coming decade. But it also had a very particular impact, of course, on the lives of individual people. And in the months before this event, before the execution, Charles I's son, Charles, Prince of Wales, as he then was kicking his heels nervously in exile, as he had been for some years, out of harm's way in the Low Countries. And you see him here in a wonderful painting in the Royal Collection. There he is with excellent shoes, as usual, dancing at a ball at The Hague. And it was on just such an occasion, or certainly in these rooms, that the young Prince of Wales, 18, encountered the person who would become the mother of the subject of my talk, the Duke of Monmouth. And we know exactly when it happened because Charles, Prince of Wales, and Lucy Walter were only in the same place for 1 week. So it was a swift courtship and clearly consummated, because when Charles left The Hague at the end of that week in July 1648, Lucy was pregnant. And here we see the two of them at about that time, or depicted at that age. Charles II, as he would shortly become, on the right there, aged about 18, with his characteristic big hair and a little adolescent moustache. And there on the left, painted I think slightly later, Lucy Walter, who was great beauty, the daughter of a Welsh family, respectable gentry family, but who had found herself for various reasons in the Hague in the late 1640s, and was quick to make the best of the affluent young men available there. And she worked her way through them pretty successfully until she made the greatest conquest of all, Charles, Prince of Wales. The relationship was pretty fleeting. There are one or two other references to their encountering one another over the next year or two, but very quickly it became a relationship of great animosity, because Lucy, who had a hard lot in life herself, which could be the subject of a talk on its own, had no qualms about using the fact that she had borne a child to the now titular King of England as a bargaining chip in trying to secure money and various other advantages. And the child who was born, you see here, painted in 1658 or thereabouts by great portrait miniaturist Samuel Cooper, inherited all of his mother's great beauty. And it was a characteristic of his much commented on throughout his life, and I think important to what happened to him, that he was agreed by everybody to be absolutely mesmerizingly good looking. Charles II took almost no interest in this child during the course of the 1650s, but he did encounter him really properly for the first time at the end of that decade. And this was after he had begun, he had commissioned a series of attempted kidnaps of the child from Lucy, because her disreputable behaviour, which had got to the point in the late 1650s of including attempted murder, was a PR disaster for the exiled king. He eventually was successful. The poor boy, aged 8, was snatched from his mother's keeping and was put in the care of one of Charles II's cronies. And it was during really a more or less chance meeting at the house of Lord Crofts, Charles II's friend, that he really was properly introduced to the boy, James, and was clearly taken with him instantly at that point. So it was the case that very few years later, when Charles II was restored to the throne, when the restoration of the monarchy and his restoration as king happened, very shortly afterwards, the boy James was called from just outside Paris, where he was living, and he came to Whitehall, the great palace of the Tudor and Stuart dynasty, which you can see in the background of this painting here, that whole collection of red brick buildings along the Thames side, from more or less Westminster Abbey on the far left, right to the far right of the screen, are the structures of Whitehall Palace. And here, the Duke of Monmouth, now aged 12, was a sensation at court. He arrived at the same time as his mother, Catherine of Braganza, and it turned out that it was his arrival at court as much as the Queen's, which was the talk of the town. His own mother had died very sadly, more or less destitute, in Paris just before the Restoration. So he was on his own. However, his father absolutely adored him, and this was clear right from the first. He was given a great slew of titles. He was made a duke twice over, Duke of Monmouth, Duke of Buccleuch. He was married to an enormously wealthy Scottish heiress, the Countess of Buccleuch, as she was, before their title was sort of upgraded. He was given tremendous income, lodgings at Whitehall right next to the king. And he grew up through his teens under the wing of his father, as you might imagine, to be a sort of archetypal Restoration playboy. And this painting I love because I think it captures that so beautifully. It's a tremendous picture, enormous in real life, and it hangs in the Great Hall at Boughton, which is a house belonging to his direct descendant, the present-day Duke of Buccleuch. And you can see him here dressed in acres of silk with amazing trimmings on his tremendous horse. His tail is all tied with ribbons. In the background, you can see his page, one of his many liveried servants dressed in the yellow silk with grey ribbons that his retainers had. And here he's dressed for command, although he actually at this stage was in charge of nothing except having a good time. Had his life ended at this point, I think his interest would have been pretty marginal. Samuel Pepys described him as vicious and idle, and as the Great Fire of London consumed the streets of the capital, he rode in, had a look and rode away again, and didn't trouble to pick up a bucket or help in any kind of way. But he would be changed. He would be changed by an experience outside Britain when he, in the late 1660s, persuaded his father to let him lead the regiment of English soldiers who were sent to join Louis XIV in fighting against the Dutch. Monmouth knew Louis XIV very well. He spoke perfect French, of course, having lived in France for a long time. And he visited Versailles the year this painting you see on the right here was painted, 1668, a great guest of honor there. But it was actually in military campaigns that Monmouth really came of age and suddenly confronted with the serious business of the management of men, of strategy, of personal risk, of responsibilities involved in military command. He, after 2 or 3 years doing that, was agreed by everybody to be a changed man. And he had, apart from anything else, won great glory for leading the English regiment and the French army that it was part of successfully to take the city of Maastricht during a famous siege in which Monmouth commanded the entire attacking force, fighting under him the young John Churchill, one day Duke of Marlborough, and the Comte d'Artagnan, the head of the French Musketeers, a real person who Dumas would later, of course, famously write about in the Three Musketeers. So after all that, Monmouth had matured as a character. He still spent amazing quantities of money on earrings and silk and shoes and wigs and hats and so on. But he was now, when he returned, put in charge of the army and became a man of great substance as far as a figure of responsibility was concerned. But crucially, this brought him into a very tricky relationship with his uncle, who you see here on the right, who we know now as James II, but who then was called Duke of York. And of course, the rub here was that, as we can see from this family tree, Charles II here had no legitimate children. He would go on to have a number of other, 11 other illegitimate children, but no legitimate children. And so the heir, his heir was his brother here, James. But this growing stature of the king's oldest son, the Duke of Monmouth, began to feel rather uncomfortable for James, Duke of York, over here. And the relationship that had been very close between uncle and nephew became increasingly uncomfortable. And this was exacerbated significantly by the fact that, so I'm just going to go back one so you can see him, that James, Duke of York on the right there, converted to Catholicism at the end of the 1660s, and this became public knowledge just at the time when the Duke of Monmouth was becoming a sort of celebrated, successful figure. And this was very, this was incendiary, the conversion of the king's brother to Catholicism at this time. Many people felt Catholicism and the threat that it posed to England's liberties and regime had been at the root of the Civil War. And come the late 1670s, the feeling on the streets about the threat of Catholicism was reaching fever pitch, not least because of the revelation about a supposed plot, Catholic plot, to assassinate Charles II, in which James, Duke of York, was himself personally implicated. You can see the relationship between uncle and nephew becoming hugely tense and competitive. And we have to remember that this was at a time when popular feeling of the masses, the crowds, the apprentices in London or in other cities was very visible. And I'm showing you here an engraving of one of the anti-Catholic parades that took place in London in 1680. And what you can see is from bottom left, snaking all the way through the streets, a series of floats carried by people you can see underneath here, who presumably can look out of little windows in the bottom of the floats they're carrying. And on the top of all of these are figures of Catholics who were regarded as religious fundamentalists of the most dangerous variety. And so there are all sorts of depictions of cardinals and bishops and monks and so on. And they were all carried through the streets until they reached Temple Bar, which you see here right in the middle of the city of London. And now you can see there's tremendous bonfire where all of these effigies were chucked on. So that was the tenor of popular feeling. So the prospect of Charles II dying and being succeeded by a Catholic who was supposed to be head of the Church of England, an upholder of the Protestant establishment and religious settlement in England, was highly, highly terrifying, actually, to a lot of people at the time. However, blameless the Catholic community essentially was on the whole. And it was in this context that the Duke of Monmouth began to part company with his father and his uncle. He too, during the time of his responsibilities in France, and then as head of the army and master of the horse and many other roles he held, had developed his own outlook and had come to have a reputation for fair-mindedness, for a sense of the injustice experienced by various of the king's citizens, subjects rather, not least the tenants of his Scottish estates, where pretty whole-scale persecution of Presbyterian and nonconformist worship was happening, and which the Duke of Monmouth repeatedly tried to persuade Charles II to stop. Evidence of him not simply joining company with those who opposed James II because he didn't like his uncle, but actually of a different set of political persuasions which the Duke of Monmouth was developing. And for those crowds on the streets, the handsome son of the king, hero of various military campaigns because others had followed, celebrity pin-up, which he definitely was very great indeed. And a huge body of popular literature, ballads and chapbooks and pamphlets were produced. I just show you two of them here, celebrating the Duke of Monmouth, songs sung about him, romanticising him. So we see on the right, England's darling, or Great Britain's joy and hope, that noble prince, James, Duke of Monmouth, and another on the left. And Monmouth began to embrace this in a very interesting way, which is really the nub of what I'm hoping to say this evening, which is that as he became essentially a significant figure of the opposition to the succession as it was going to happen due to the hereditary principle, he began to participate in a series of very interesting national political campaigning trips. So in at the very end of the 1670s, the strength of feeling about the threat that James, Duke of York, posed to the English political establishment was such that a bill was introduced into the House of Commons to change the succession and to exclude James, Duke of York, from the succession. An extraordinary thing to see Parliament trying to legislate to determine the succession and not simply to sort of ratify it happening on the basis of the hereditary principle. And the Duke of Monmouth voted for this. The bill was defeated in the House of Lords. It passed in the House of Commons comprehensively, but was defeated in the House of Lords. But that took a period of time to happen, and there were a series of very tense parliamentary sessions, and both before and after those, the Whigs, as they were known, those who were for changing the succession, and their dashing figurehead, the Duke of Monmouth, made the absolute most of the potential to get out into the towns and streets of England to ensure that people voted in the parliamentary elections in a way that would see their cause favoured. So Monmouth was crucial to these, and they were billed as sporting trips. So they included a trip up to Cheshire to participate in horse races there, and a hunting trip, but which included massive political rallies where thousands, absolutely thousands, and the numbers survive, of people who supported the opposition movement came out to celebrate his presence, and he played the part brilliantly. He was a tremendous operator when it came to interactions with ordinary people. When he was in Chester, he agreed to be the godfather to the mayor of Chester's baby daughter. He said he'd participate in the town's races that were happening, and he ran with his shoes on, and then he ran with his shoes off. He won both times and presented the cup that he won to his new goddaughter. And he had a great talent for using his own glamour, if you like, his own celebrity, to further the cause of the political movement that he was a part of. He also went down to the West Country. It was a big trip down here into Devon and Somerset. And there was also a series of trips, which is where I'm going to home in on, down to Sussex. And specifically, I'm showing you a close-up here of a map of the sort of western side of West Sussex, the border with Hampshire. So you can see Hampshire on the left. And here, over a series of winters, right the way through these tense political years, in 1679, again in 1680, 81, 82, and 83, he went to stay with his friend, or certainly his political colleague, Lord Grey, who owned this property Uppark, which we all now known as the National Trust House, which you can see here. And it was during these trips, again, billed as hunting expeditions, and hunting absolutely took place every year. But these were really a subtext for political campaigning, in particular in Chichester, which is just off the bottom of this engraving here. And the landscape round and about was terrific for hunting. You can see off here to the east of our park a great wood and an undulating landscape, which was ideal for fox hunting, which was the kind of hunting that was going on here. And I just point out to you on this slide, I don't know if you can see it, but here on the right-hand side, about halfway down, a place called Charlton. So bear that in mind, because it becomes important shortly. And I show you an image at the bottom left there of the lovely landscape around, but to the east of our park, around Charlton, which was where the hunting took place. So on the one hand, the Duke of Monmouth and Lord Grey, who was one of his Whig collaborators, billed the trips as hunting trips. They happened each year just after Christmas in the early months of the year. But there are wonderful detailed descriptions of the pretty full-on political campaigning that was going on. So, for example, in one of those trips, Monmouth did a kind of classic politicians walk around and through the streets of Chichester, stopping to talk to whole series of people, very much the tradesfolk of the town, members of the corporation and so on, about the next meeting of Parliament and why it was important it should happen soon, and the need to petition the government on the matter of the succession. So he wasn't ducking the question, but at the same time doing it with a sort of star quality that would be very powerful. So in one of those exchanges, he talked for a long time, and I think about an hour, to an old Quaker gentleman who was sucking on his pipe and having a political discussion with him. The Quaker kept his hat on, because that's what Quakers do, because they didn't remove their hats as an act of deference. But the Duke of Monmouth, although he was a premier aristocrat of the age and was dressed from head to toe in red silk, took his hat off and held it under his arm the whole way through the conversation, which was, everyone found very charming, that he was so respectful of somebody who was so much his social inferior. And the king and the government were given daily reports of what was going on in Chichester. The county militia was on standby in case there were riots. So there was no doubt in anyone's mind the real reason for these hunting trips. And as I mentioned, they were fox hunting. And this in itself is an interesting thing, because hunting, as many of you know well, was a favoured pastime of the aristocracy and the monarchy all the way through the Middle Ages. But when we talk about hunting in the Middle Ages or in the Tudor period, we're talking about deer hunting. And it really was only at the Restoration that fox hunting became a respectable, indeed a high status thing to do. And this was born very much of the scale of the destruction of hunting parks, the enormous hunting parks you needed if you were hunting deer, which followed the end of the Civil War, the sale of the royal estates, and the deforestation of a lot of aristocratic lands. So the sort of landscape you needed for fox hunting was different, and it had historically been seen rather as a kind of farmer's pastime to get rid of vermin, rather than a sort of glamorous act and pastime of the nobility. But the Duke of Monmouth's participation in these fox hunts in the landscape of West Sussex would be part of what would really change its reputation as a pastime, to become very much synonymous with the sort of upper echelons of society. So while Monmouth was busy campaigning for the opposition, he relinquished all his posts at court and in the government, or rather he had them taken from him, because he was seen now as being a figure who couldn't be relied upon by the king and by his brother. And the beneficiaries of this were in part the king's other illegitimate children. And crucially, I show you here the young Duke of Richmond, the son of Charles II's last serious mistress, Louise de Keroualle, who this boy, and he really was only a boy at the time, was the principal beneficiary of the Duke of Monmouth losing his positions, crucially including that of Master of the Horse, which was a very prestigious office at court in charge of all of the horses and racing and hunting activity of the court. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Well, all the political campaigning that Monmouth participated in essentially came to nothing. The opposition failed to get the exclusion bill through Parliament. Charles II reasserted his authority, abolished, or rather dismissed Parliament in the early 1680s, and wouldn't call it again for the next 5 years, determined to do without it rather than to have them meddling in his affairs. And when Monmouth, along with some of his Whig colleagues, were implicated in a plot in 1683 for a military uprising, he was forced into a more permanent sort of an exile, and he went to the Low Countries with his mistress, beloved and long-standing mistress, who you see here, Henrietta Lady Wentworth. And this is where he was when the news came of Charles II's death in 1685. And it was following that news that he was persuaded, and it was persuaded because he was very reluctant to begin with, to lead a military uprising to try to prevent his uncle James from occupying the throne. And it was, to cut a very long story short, a disaster. And it ended on this melancholy landscape, Sejmore in Somerset, in a battle that was fought through the night in June 1685, the fighting taking place almost exclusively in complete darkness, which is an extraordinary thing. Monmouth's men, numerous and enthusiastic, but very poorly provided with arms, armour and weaponry, with no military training to speak of, and many of them fighting only with these which you see on the left, which are agricultural scythes straightened out to form weapons. These two amazingly survive in the Royal Armouries. And it was here that his cause came to an end. The only nobleman who joined him was Lord Grey, the chap he'd stayed with at Uppark, but he was a total liability. And at the crucial moment, when the cavalry were to charge, Monmouth cavalry were to charge, Lord Grey lost his nerve and rode off with them away from the battlefield, leading Monmouth to lead the infantry alone and to this defeat, which then certainly lay before him. And in only a matter of 10 days later, or a week later, after Lord Grey had been discovered and had betrayed Monmouth's hiding place, and he had therefore been captured, the Duke of Monmouth was beheaded on Tower Hill in the most gory execution you could possibly imagine, where it took the executioner 5 consecutive strokes of his axe to sever the Duke's head. And the crowd was absolutely silent and remarked upon by everybody to display not the usual baying, tomato throwing enthusiasm for the execution, but deep sadness at the passing of the Duke. The failure of Monmouth's rebellion and his execution gave James II, as he now was, free reign, but fears about his suitability as king were proved largely right, as he embarked upon a whole series of measures which horrified those in the political establishment, or at least the majority of them, including rigging elections, rigging the judiciary, and seeking to promote Catholicism against the explicit promises he'd given. So James II's days were numbered, and it was only 3 years later that the Duke of Monmouth's great friend, William of Orange, launched his invasion fleet to try to take the kingdom from James II. And this picture, which shows the William III's army arriving in Tor Bay, which has wonderful details like all the horses wading ashore, is a reminder that for all the talk of the Glorious Revolution and the William III's invitation to take the throne and so on, it was absolutely a military invasion. And whereas the Duke of Monmouth had arrived in 3 ships with an initial invasion force of 80 men, William III arrived with 500 ships and 23,000 men. So it's perhaps unsurprising that they fared differently in their attempts. So what came after that? Lord Grey, he who had been Monmouth's hunting partner in Sussex through all those political campaigns, who'd fought, or rather had ridden into battle alongside him and then ridden away at the crucial moment, who had betrayed the whereabouts of the Duke of Monmouth to James II's officers, allowing for his capture. He didn't face the same fate as Monmouth. Instead, he made an incredibly detailed confession of every single element of the invasion, naming every single name, every single person who'd been party to it in any way, shape or form, which bought him his life. It would be a significant contributory factor to the really horrific retribution that was inflicted upon the people who'd participated in that uprising, and which Judge Jeffreys famously doled out at the bloody assizes. But Lord Grey was a survivor and the sort of political operator that Monmouth wasn't to his disadvantage. And he not only managed to get his estates back, but when William III succeeded as king, he was made an Earl, the Earl of Tankerville. And the landscape around his house at Uppark and the hunting that he had participated in with the Duke of Monmouth became a great pastime for him. And he retained this chap on the right, or he worked with this chap on the right, Mr. Roper, who is a great huntsman, to develop the hunting at Uppark to make it one of the great hunting and sporting and political gatherings of the country. He rebuilt his house, Uppark, which now, in the form that it is now, still retains as a property of the National Trust. You can see it here. And he oversaw the creation of a whole new and very a sort of famous set of winter gatherings in Sussex, and specifically focused on that little village called Charlton, which we saw in the map a few minutes ago. It may well have been that this was always where the hunting happened and that this was where Monmouth himself hunted. Certainly that was what was said thereafter. But it became so celebrated for fox hunting that it began to draw other people to that part of the world. And among those was the young, now not so young, Duke of Richmond, Monmouth's half-brother, who had, as I said, benefited from his loss of titles. And he took a lease on a house, which you see on the right there, called Goodwood, which was handily placed for hunting at Charlton, which was the reason that he came there. And that soon developed the Charlton Hunt, as it was now known, into a great national institution for the upper crust of English society. And it was the second Duke of Richmond, who you see here on the left, who became master of the Charlton Hunt, together with the heir of Lord Grey, the next Lord Tankerville, and who would be responsible for one of the many building projects that then happened in this little village at the heart of Charlton, which became a sort of glamour hotspot of the home counties through the course of the 1730s. So we see here on the left an estate map showing the village of Charlton with all these little buildings. It's no bigger really than this now. And the building that the second Duke of Richmond commissioned in Charlton is that you see on the right, which we know today as Foxhall. And it's the one shown down at the bottom here where the letter Z is. And it was next to a great room that was built to designs by Lord Burlington, the third Earl of Burlington, and a series of other buildings were commissioned by aristocrats through this village, which essentially were sort of overnight lodgings for those aristocrats when they were at the Charlton Hunt, and then they would all convene in the great room here to feast and tell hunting stories and politic in the evenings. So they were very particular building type. Foxhall is a very particular building type, a small one room really, little palace, if you like, for short overnight stays, a kind of B&B of the fanciest sort of its day. And you see Foxhall there now as it is today, the building itself, the landscape beyond, and also the stable block that faces it. So it was really a bedroom and a little bit of service area and a place for your horses. The Duke of Richmond still owned Goodwood, which is only 3 or 4 miles away, and it's a sign of how much being part of the revelry in the village of Charlton mattered that he built this house here, even though he could easily have gone home. He built this building here, even though he could easily have gone home to his principal residence. And this gives you a flavour of what it must have been like. This is when the Charlton Hunt was restaged a few years ago. The Dukes of Richmond invested lots of money in the course of the later 18th century in Goodwood itself, and it was rebuilt to look like this as it does today. And over time, by the end of the 18th century, the Charlton Hunt had moved to Goodwood itself, and great kennels were built there by James Wyatt, and the village of Charlton ceased to be the HQ of the hunt, and the big house, as it now was, of Goodwood became the mainstay of that activity. Meanwhile, Little Foxhall stopped being this glamorous bedsit and became instead a tenanted building, and you can see it on the left there. It was lived in by a series of managers of the local sawmill, and it was bought from the Goodwood estate by one of the tenants, and it was put up for sale in the 1970s in a state of some disrepair. And that was when the brilliant visionary that was Sir John Smith, the founder of the Landmark Trust, knowing this story of this extraordinary place, swooped in, and the building was acquired by the Landmark. And you can see there on the right, former colleagues of ours busy in the business of trying to work out what the original paint colours were and so on. And here it is today. The downstairs now is a Landmark Trust building sleeping 4, and then the wonderful upstairs room, which, as you can see, just has a bed in the alcove. And although none of this furniture, of course, is original, I think it gives you quite a flavour of what it must have been like when the Duke of Richmond was staying here on these hunting trips. And we have an inventory for it that shows that the only crockery and cutlery there was the stuff you needed for breakfast, because clearly the feasting was happening up the street. And on the roof, a weather vane, which has this wonderful fox on it, which was commissioned by Landmark, but it was a set of kind of the mechanical arrangements, our original ones, which enabled the clock over the mantelpiece, which I hope you can see there, or the dial over the mantelpiece rather, to tell you the direction of the wind, which of course is crucial when you're fox hunting, to know what's upwind and downwind in tracking the fox. And that tradition of glamorous sporting events, which Monmouth was absolutely the progenitor of in this landscape, of course continues today, and glorious Goodwood and many other sporting things go on there, and still the celebrities come. And I found this nice picture of Tom Cruise having a jolly day out at the Goodwood races. I think unaware that the Duke of Monmouth trod first where he treads now. So there I will leave it. A reminder, I think, that the separate spheres that we might think exist of sporting activities or recreation, aristocratic, self-enjoyment, and those of hard politics are not in fact completely separate, but very much overlap. And I think the Duke of Monmouth was a classic case in point of that. And although he died on that scaffold at the Tower of London, the things that he fought for did prosper. And I like to think that he would look back and feel that he had in fact achieved something rather amazing in his short life. And if you're interested to know more about it, I just flash up a picture there of my book about him, which is available and has so much more to it than I've covered this evening. But anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed hearing a bit about it.